Welcome back to It's the Law with Morelli Churko. My name is Howie Reimer. Joining me once again is Rachel Lammers, who is an expert in estate and family litigation. Do you like the word expert?
I'm uncomfortable with that, but it's certainly something that I do my best to practice well in.
Okay, and more specifically, we're talking about child support. Is this just a mess that continues on generation after generation, or are people becoming more educated and they know a little bit more going into these uncomfortable situations regarding child support?
I like to think that when a couple splits up and they have a child together, they are aware that there's financial obligations one to the other. There's a lot of questions that come up about, well, what is child support and how much is it, and do I still have to pay under these circumstances? And so there's a lot of questions about it. Most people understand that when you split up from your spouse or your girlfriend, boyfriend, and you have a child together, that in most cases, the non-custodial parent is paying some sort of support to the other parent to help support the child. But beyond that, it can get a little more complicated, and that's a true proposition. But how it's calculated is sometimes a bit of a tricky matter. In most cases, a payor of child support, it's based on a chart. It's that simple. If you earn this much income, then you pay this much for one child or for two child, and it literally is on a chart. And this is the same thing throughout all of Canada. It's called the Federal Child Support Guidelines, and any Google search you come up with it, most people know about the child support guidelines and have some idea about what they'd be likely to pay or receive in a child support situation.
What is the biggest misconception, and how complicated can things get with shared custody and so forth?
Shared custody is boy, there's a lot of misconceptions about how child support works in a shared custody situation. First of all, a shared custody situation is defined to be where parents share parenting of the child on roughly an equal basis. It's defined to be 40% or more of the time over the course of a whole year. So not just that 1 month in the summer, but over the course of a whole year. And when there's a shared parenting situation, the court doesn't just look at the tables, the Federal Child Support Guideline tables, but the court also gets to look at other factors, like what are the incomes of both the parties, what is the household incomes of both the parties, what's the living situation of both the parties, and on a consideration of all of those factors can come up with a number. It's not as clear-cut as where the one parent is the primary parent and the other one isn't.
What is the age where kids age out of child support?
Well, the age of majority in British Columbia is 19. And so that's the presumptive age at which child support is considered to typically stop. That's just the presumption. Sometimes a child becomes independent at age 17 when they move out and have a full-time job. That's not the most common scenario. But sometimes after age 19, a child may continue to be dependent on their parents for reasons of, for example, they're disabled, or they are continuing on with their education and aren't working. And those are reasons, most common of which is education, that child support may continue for that child. Even if they're living out of town to attend university somewhere else, they could still be entitled to receive support if they're not independent, which is really the issue.
Last time we spoke about legal fees, we were talking about not being able to pay your lawyer and what are some of the options there. What about when it comes to paying child support, and what happens then?
Well, lawyers always look at legal issues from a standpoint of what is the prevailing state of the law, what would a court say, and what does the legislation say in these circumstances. And I can tell you that a judge, doesn't have a lot of sympathy for excuses, if I could put it that way. Things like, well, I have too many debts. I have a new family and I have these other obligations, or I have too many bills is a pretty common one. Child support is deemed to be the number one priority. That means more important than your car payment, more important than your mortgage payment, more important than anything. And so excuses about my financial circumstances or that I can't afford it If you have a certain amount of income, the court presumes that you will prioritize your child support obligations over everything else. And for a lot of people, that's a big adjustment. It's a big adjustment just to be splitting up with your spouse. That's a big financial adjustment. But a further adjustment is paying child support. It can be a difficult transition for people.
We've heard the term deadbeat dads, deadbeat parents, and I imagine it goes both ways now. What happens when the parent who's supposed to be paying does not pay up? What's your recourse?
Well, certainly, there's deadbeat dads and there's deadbeat moms, and that's it's maybe not a nice phrase, but it refers to a certain situation where the payor of support doesn't want to or can't for whatever reason, he says, or isn't for whatever reason paying support. And in those cases, what we advise people ought to do, recipients of support, they ought to be filing with the Family Maintenance Enforcement Program. And the acronym is FMEP. It's the British Columbia Enforcement Agency of Support. Every province in every state in the U.S., for that matter, has such a similar type of organization, and they will monitor support payments. Even if the other party is paying, but you don't want to deal with them, you can deal with this third party who will handle the collecting of the support checks and things on your behalf and remit the payments on to you. If a payor is refusing to pay, they have wide-ranging powers to compel payment from people, and that includes garnishing bank accounts, garnishing wages, seizing assets like vehicles, even RRSPs. They have a lot of power to make sure that the support gets paid.
Compel. I like that word.
Well, it's not a happy situation, but you have to understand what courts and what the government thinks is the most important is that children are taken care of. And that is more important than any other obligations that people have.
So again, how does one go about getting a child support order?
If you want to get a child support order, there's lots of ways to do it. I recommend at least having a brief conversation with a lawyer just to be sure that you're bringing the claim for support in the right court jurisdiction. You can bring a claim in provincial court, you can bring a claim in Supreme Court, or you can also perhaps enter into a written agreement with the other party about these things. It doesn't have to be a court order, and Family Maintenance will enforce on an agreement in the same way that they would enforce on an order. But when the parties don't agree, there's only two ways to resolve such a dispute. That's by an agreement or by a judge. And so one of those two ways is how you can get your order. Get some advice from a lawyer about which is the right path for you.
Great information. Thanks as always.
Thank you.
It's The Law with Morelli Churko and Rachel Lammers.